The mahogany reception desk sat beneath a crystal chandelier, casting fractured light across marble floors that had witnessed 3 decades of whispered legal battles and desperate pleas for justice. Grace Williams looked up from her computer screen as the glass doors exploded inward with a force that made the framed law degrees on the wall tremble. The woman who burst through wore a white Chanel suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months. Her blonde hair swept back in a style that screamed old money and new rage. Vanessa Sterling stood in the center of the reception area. Like a tornado made flesh, her finger pointed directly at Grace and the younger woman beside her. "That's not your real daughter," Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling and silencing every conversation in the firm. Grace felt Lily's hand grip her arm, felt her daughter's body go rigid with shock. 2 weeks had passed since Marcus Sterling's Mercedes had wrapped itself around a highway divider at 90 miles per hour. 2 weeks since Vanessa had appeared at the funeral, with her belly just beginning to curve beneath designer black. 2 weeks since she had whispered her poison into anyone who would listen. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Grace Williams had worked as a receptionist at Morrison & Associates for 5 years now, her 52 years evident in the silver threading through her dark hair, always twisted into a neat bun at the base of her neck. She wore the same rotation of cardigans in muted colors over simple blouses and slacks, the kind of outfit that made her invisible to the partners who swept past her desk each morning without acknowledgement. The younger associates sometimes remembered to nod, their eyes already on their phones or the stack of case files under their arms. Grace had perfected the art of being unseen, of blending into the furniture like the leather chairs in the waiting area or the silk plants that someone watered every Tuesday, despite them being artificial. But 28 years ago, on a March night that had started with freezing rain and ended with a miracle, Grace had found a bundle on her doorstep, wrapped in a thin blanket that did nothing against the cold. The baby girl inside had skin pale as moonlight and eyes that locked onto Grace's face with an intensity that felt like recognition. No note, no explanation, just 6 months of life abandoned on concrete steps. Grace had called the police, filed reports, waited through the investigation that turned up nothing, then filed for adoption through proper legal channels that took 18 months to complete. Every form filled out, every home visit endured, every penny saved to prove she could provide. Lily became hers in every way that mattered, and Grace had built her entire existence around making sure her daughter never felt the cold of that March night again. Vanessa Sterling had entered their lives 2 years ago as the new marketing director at Sterling Enterprises, the commercial real estate development company that Marcus had inherited from his father and grown into something that generated the kind of wealth that corrupted judgment. Grace had watched Vanessa at the wedding reception, noting how the woman's eyes followed Marcus even as she made small talk with Lily about flower arrangements and honeymoon destinations. Vanessa had the kind of beauty that opened doors and clouded minds, all high cheekbones and practiced smiles that never quite reached her pale blue eyes. She came from Connecticut money, the kind of family that had portraits in halls and trust funds that matured before their heirs learned to walk. At 35, Vanessa had never worked a job she actually needed, had never felt the weight of choosing between electricity and groceries, had never understood what it meant to sacrifice. She treated service workers like stage props, invisible until needed, disposable once used. Grace had seen how Vanessa looked at during those first family dinners, the slight curl of her lip when Marcus introduced Grace as Lily's mother, the way she would interrupt Grace mid-sentence to ask Marcus about his business or comment on the wine selection. The microaggressions came wrapped in politeness, little cuts designed to remind Grace of her place. "You must be so proud that Lily married up," Vanessa had said once, her tone suggesting that up was the only direction available when you started from where Grace supposedly stood. Grace had smiled and sipped her water and filed the comment away with all the others. The sacrifices had started before Lily could form memories and continued through every year that followed. Grace had worked 3 jobs when Lily was young, The receptionist position during the day, data entry at night, weekend shifts cleaning office buildings when she could arrange childcare with neighbors who accepted payment in home-cooked meals and returned favors. She had sold the small house her parents left her, the only inheritance she had, to pay for Lila's tuition at the private school where the other children arrived in cars that cost more than Grace's annual salary. The school counselor had called it an investment, had praised Grace's dedication while looking at her worn shoes and secondhand coat with something between admiration and pity. Grace had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every science fair, sitting in rooms where she was often the only black face and always the only one who arrived on public transportation. She had helped with homework at kitchen tables covered in bills she was juggling, had celebrated Lila's acceptance to Columbia with tears that mixed pride and panic over how to pay for it. The scholarships helped, but never covered everything, and Grace had taken out loans she would be repaying until she qualified for Social Security. Marcus had seemed different at first, had called Grace Mom without prompting, had insisted on paying off those student loans as a wedding gift and setting up a monthly transfer to Grace's account to make sure she never struggled again. For 18 months, Grace had allowed herself to believe her daughter had found security and love in equal measure, had let herself exhale for the first time in decades. Then Marcus changed, the shift so gradual Grace almost missed it. The monthly transfers stopped without explanation. The invitations to family dinners grew less frequent, then ceased entirely. When Grace called, Marcus answered with the tone people reserve for telemarketers, all false politeness and obvious impatience to end the conversation. Lily made excuses, stress at work, big project deadlines, they would get together soon, but soon stretched into months. Grace had started watching more carefully then, had noticed how Marcus looked at his phone during the rare dinners they did share, how he stepped away to take calls with a secrecy that felt deliberate. She had followed him once, a Thursday evening, when he told Lily he had a late meeting with investors, and watched him meet Vanessa at a restaurant in the West Village where the tables cost more per meal than Grace spent on groceries in a month. They had sat close, too close, Vanessa's hand on his arm, her head tilted in that way that suggested intimacy beyond business. Grace had photographed them through the window, not knowing yet what she would do with the evidence, only understanding that her daughter's marriage was built on sand that was already shifting. When Marcus collapsed at his desk from what the autopsy would later reveal was a massive heart attack triggered by a lethal combination of cocaine and stress, Grace had felt sorrow for Lily's pain, but none for the man who had betrayed her daughter's trust. She had kept her silence about the affair, had held Lily through her grief, and had watched Vanessa appear at the funeral with calculation in her eyes and a hand pressed to her barely showing belly. Grace had learned patience from years of being underestimated, had mastered the skill of watching and waiting while others assumed her silence meant ignorance or acceptance. She sat at the reception desk with her back straight and her hands folded, the picture of calm, while Vanessa's accusations filled the air like smoke from a fire designed to consume everything Grace had built. The firm's senior partners had begun emerging from their offices, drawn by the commotion, their expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation at having their billable hours interrupted. Richard Thornton, the managing partner with silver hair and a reputation for taking only cases that guaranteed seven-figure settlements, stood in his doorway with his arms crossed, watching Grace with the kind of assessment usually reserved for opposing counsel. Sarah Chen from estate planning had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with shock that might have been genuine or performative depending on who was watching. Tom Rodriguez from corporate law kept glancing between Grace and Vanessa, like a spectator at a tennis match, uncertain where to direct his attention or allegiance. Grace had typed their memos, scheduled their meetings, organized their files for 5 years, and not one of them knew the first true thing about her. She had a key to the basement archive that no one had thought to ask about, access to files that dated back 40 years, and a storage box in the corner behind the 1,985 case records that contained documents she visited every few months to make sure they remained preserved and ready. Vanessa Sterling had made a fundamental error in judgment, the kind that came from privilege and ignorance mixing into overconfidence. She had assumed Grace was exactly what she appeared to be, and that assumption was about to cost her everything she thought she had won. Grace remembered the exact moment she became a mother in ways that transcended biology and paperwork. It was not the night she found Lily on her doorstep, though that had been the beginning, nor was it the day the judge signed the adoption decree 18 months later, though that had made it legal. The moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Lily was 3 years old, sitting at their kitchen table in her pink pajamas with the feet worn through at the toes. Lily had looked up from her cereal, milk dripping from her spoon, and said "Mama" with such casual certainty that Grace's heart had cracked open and rebuilt itself around that single word. There had been no fanfare, no witnesses. Just a little girl with skin 3 shades lighter than Grace's own and a bond that ran deeper than genetics could measure. Grace had raised Lily through chicken pox and multiplication tables, through first crushes and college applications, through every milestone that builds a life from scratch. She had braided hair that had different texture than her own, had learned about sunscreen requirements she had never needed, had navigated questions from strangers who looked at them, and immediately started calculating whether adoption or marriage explained the racial difference. Grace had answered those questions with patience that came from love, had taught Lily that family was built through choice and commitment, rather than inherited through blood. Now Vanessa Sterling stood in the middle of Morrison and Associates demanding that Grace prove what should never require proof, attempting to sever 28 years of motherhood with accusations designed to exploit the exact prejudices Grace had spent decades overcoming. Vanessa's campaign began on social media before it ever reached the courthouse, a calculated strategy designed to shape public opinion before facts could interfere with narrative. She created an Instagram account devoted entirely to her pregnancy journey, posting filtered photos of her growing belly beside captions that dripped with carefully crafted victimhood. "My baby deserves their father's legacy," one post read, accompanied by a photo of Marcus at his desk looking successful and untroubled. Another post showed Vanessa standing outside, Morrison and Associates, with a caption, "Some people take what doesn't belong to them and call it love." She never named Grace directly, maintaining just enough plausibility deniability to avoid immediate legal consequences, but her followers connected the dots through comments she liked and subtle responses that confirmed their assumptions. The story she constructed was simple and devastating in its implications. A wealthy white man had married a woman whose mother was just a receptionist, someone who had taken in a white baby without proper legal documentation, someone who had social climbed through her daughter and was now trying to steal an inheritance meant for Vanessa's unborn child. The racial dynamics were never stated explicitly, but threaded through every post like poison in honey, designed to activate biases while maintaining surface-level respectability. Within 3 days, the story had been picked up by local news blogs hungry for content that combined wealth, race, family drama, and legal intrigue. Grace had watched it unfold from her apartment, reading comments from strangers who felt entitled to judge her life based on carefully edited information and their own prejudices. "You people always looking for handouts," one comment read. "Probably welfare fraud too," suggested another. The atmosphere at Morrison and Associates shifted like weather changing before a storm, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious as Vanessa's campaign gained momentum. Sarah Chen, who had worked in estate planning for 7 years and had always been cordial to Grace, began taking the long route to her office to avoid passing the reception desk. When Grace said "Good morning," Sarah's response came out rushed and uncomfortable, her eyes fixed somewhere over Grace's shoulder rather than making contact. Tom Rodriguez stopped asking Grace to order lunch for client meetings, started handling his own scheduling, created distance through 1,000 small withdrawals that added up to rejection. The younger associates whispered in the break room, their conversations dying the moment Grace entered to refill her coffee. She heard fragments anyway, caught phrases like adoption fraud and investigation, and you never really know people floating in the air like smoke she was meant to inhale. Richard Thornton, the managing partner, who had never acknowledged Grace's existence beyond perfunctory nods, suddenly found her very interesting. He called her into his office on a Thursday afternoon, his corner suite overlooking Manhattan and decorated with diplomas from schools that cost more per semester than Grace had earned in entire years during her early struggling period. "We need to discuss the situation," he said, his tone suggesting the situation was her fault rather than something being done to her. "The firm has a reputation to maintain," he continued, "and given the publicity, it might be best if you took a leave of absence until this matter is resolved." His words were phrased as suggestion, but delivered as demand, wrapped in the kind of corporate politeness that disguised coercion as concern. Grace had looked at him across his mahogany desk and responded with quiet precision. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will continue to do my job unless you can cite specific policy violations or legal requirements that mandate otherwise." Richard's face had tightened, unused to resistance from someone he considered beneath his station, but he had no grounds to force the issue without exposing the firm to wrongful termination claims. The exploitation became systematic rather than merely social, a coordinated effort to isolate Grace from any support or resources that might help her fight back. Vanessa hired a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management and reputation rehabilitation, except in this case they were creating the crisis and destroying the reputation rather than repairing one. Press releases went out to local media outlets framing the situation as a David versus Goliath story, with Vanessa as David despite her wealth and connections. The narrative positioned Grace as someone who had exploited a vulnerable infant for personal gain, who had raised Lily to marry money, who was now attempting to deny Vanessa's baby their rightful inheritance. The racial subtext remained unspoken but unmistakable, relying on stereotypes about black women and welfare fraud and social climbing that had been poisoning public discourse for generations. Television stations began requesting interviews with Vanessa, who appeared in soft focus lighting, wearing understated jewelry and designer maternity wear, her hands resting on her belly in poses calculated to evoke maternal protection. She spoke with practiced sadness about Marcus' death, about discovering the truth about Lily's adoption, about her duty to ensure her child received what was legally theirs. When asked about Grace, Vanessa's expression shifted to something between pity and disapproval. "I'm sure she believed she was doing the right thing," Vanessa said, her tone suggesting the opposite. Grace watched the interviews with Lily, saw her daughter's face crumble with each implication and accusation, felt the weight of her decision to maintain secrecy about her past pressing down like stones on her chest. The harassment extended to Grace's daily life. Anonymous letters arriving at her apartment accusing her of crimes she had never committed, phone calls from numbers that disconnected when she answered, strangers recognizing her on the subway and making comments just loud enough for her to hear. Grace had built her life around hope that proved fragile when tested by sustained assault on its foundations. She had hoped Lily would trust their bond enough to weather accusations without wavering, would remember every sacrifice and moment of love, and know in her bones that Grace had always acted with her best interests centered. But hope required certainty, and Vanessa's campaign was designed specifically to inject doubt into every certainty Grace and Lily had shared. The first crack appeared during a phone call 3 days after Vanessa's television interview, Lily's voice tight with stress and confusion, asking questions Grace could not yet answer fully. "Mom, did you legally adopt me?" Lily asked, and Grace had said yes immediately because it was true. "Then why can't Vanessa's lawyer find any records under your name?" Lily continued, her voice breaking on the last word. Grace explained there were complications with the records, issues of privacy and sealed documents, but it sounded like evasion even to her own ears because she was evading, dancing around the truth without fully embracing it. The conversation ended badly, Lily frustrated and frightened, Grace aching to explain everything but knowing the timing was not right. That revelation required precision and context she could not provide over the phone. Their next meeting was worse. Lily arriving at Grace's apartment with eyes swollen from crying and questions that came out like accusations, despite her obvious struggle to remain neutral. "Why won't you just show me the adoption papers?" Lily demanded, and Grace had tried to explain about sealed records and privacy laws while hating herself for the half-truths that were technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. Lily had left after 20 minutes, saying she needed space to process, and Grace had stood in her doorway watching her daughter walk away and wondering if Vanessa had succeeded in destroying the one thing Grace had built her entire life around protecting. Vanessa's confidence grew with each small victory, each news story, each social media post that went viral, until she began making mistakes born from the arrogance that comes from never having faced real opposition. She scheduled a press conference for a Tuesday afternoon, sending invitations to every major news outlet in New York, with the promise of major revelations about the Sterling estate case. The event was held at a whole conference room that cost more to rent for 2 hours than Grace paid in monthly rent. Vanessa positioned behind a podium with her lawyer standing beside her like a prop meant to convey legitimacy. She wore navy blue, the color of trustworthiness, according to whatever image consultant she had hired, her hair styled in soft waves that suggested approachability while her expression conveyed determination. Vanessa began by thanking everyone for coming and expressing her sadness about the circumstances that made the press conference necessary. She spoke about Marcus with affection that might have been genuine but felt performed, talked about their relationship and their baby as though those facts erased the reality that their relationship had been built on betrayal of his marriage vows. Then Vanessa shifted to her findings about Lily's adoption, presenting copies of documents her private investigator had obtained through methods Grace suspected were not entirely legal. "There is no record of any adoption under the name Grace Williams," Vanessa announced, her voice carrying across the room with practiced projection. "No birth certificate, no adoption decree, no legal documentation that this woman had any right to raise my husband's wife." The racial element that Vanessa had kept implicit suddenly became explicit in her next sentence, delivered with venom that shocked even the reporters accustomed to conflict. "That old black woman is a fraud and a thief who took advantage of a helpless infant and has been exploiting that situation for 28 years. The words hung in the air, recorded by a dozen cameras, preserved for posterity and legal proceedings. Grace watched the live stream from her laptop and allowed herself a small smile, recognizing the fatal error that overconfidence always produced. The court date arrived with the weight of inevitability, scheduled for a Monday morning in a Manhattan courthouse that Grace had visited dozens of times in her former life, back when she walked its halls as an attorney rather than a defendant in the court of public opinion. The hearing was meant to be preliminary, a chance for both sides to present initial arguments about the validity of Lily's inheritance claim, given the questions about her adoption. Lily sat in the gallery looking exhausted and heartbroken, her professional clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight from stress and grief. Grace had not spoken to her daughter in 3 days, their last conversation ending with Lily saying she did not know what to believe anymore, and Grace understanding that trust once questioned required proof to rebuild. Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a man named Douglas Barrett who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for aggressive tactics that skirted ethical boundaries without quite crossing them. Barrett had filed motions requesting DNA testing to prove Lily was not Grace's biological child, as though that fact was ever in question or mattered to the legal standing of a properly executed adoption. He had also filed requests for Grace's financial records going back 28 years, presumably looking for evidence of fraud or exploitation, unaware that those records would reveal a woman who had given everything rather than taken anything. Grace arrived 30 minutes early, sitting alone on a bench in the hallway and watching lawyers and plaintiffs and defendants flow past like water around a stone. She thought about the last time she had been in this building as attorney Grace Montgomery, arguing a case about parental rights and adoption law, winning a precedent-setting decision that was still cited in family court. That felt like a different lifetime, a different person, though only 28 years separated then from now. Robert Chen found Grace sitting in the hallway and sat beside her without asking permission, his presence both surprising and somehow inevitable. Robert was 34 years old, a junior partner at Morrison and Associates, who specialized in corporate law but had a background in family court from his early career at Legal Aid. He had watched Grace at the firm for 3 years, had noticed how she read legal briefs with the speed and comprehension of someone with training, had caught her offering advice to paralegals that was too sophisticated to come from casual observation. When Vanessa's accusation started spreading through the office, Robert had felt something was wrong with the narrative, but could not identify what until he started researching the firm's history. Morrison and Associates had been founded in 1975, but it had nearly collapsed in bankruptcy in 1995 before a junior partner named Grace Montgomery had brought in 3 major clients and negotiated settlements that saved the firm and made her the youngest senior partner in its history. Robert had found old newspaper articles about her cases, photos from bar association events showing a woman in her 20s with confidence and intelligence radiating from her smile. The photos matched the receptionist in his office perfectly, allowing for 28 years of aging. Robert had gone to Grace's apartment the night before the hearing with a folder full of evidence and a simple question. "Why did you hide?" he asked, and Grace had answered with the truth. "Because I wanted to protect my daughter from expectations and judgment, and because I wanted to see what kind of man Marcus Sterling truly was when he thought I was powerless." Robert had nodded, understanding immediately, and offered to help in whatever capacity she needed. Now he sat beside her in the courthouse and said quietly, "You don't have to represent yourself. I can file an appearance as your attorney," and Grace shook her head with certainty. "I need to do this myself," she replied, "but thank you for believing me when no one else did." The courtroom felt smaller than Grace remembered from her years practicing law, though the dimensions had not changed, only her perspective and the weight of what she was about to reveal. Judge Patricia Morrison entered at exactly 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took her seat at the bench, her expression suggesting she had reviewed the case files and found them troubling in ways that transcended simple inheritance disputes. Patricia Morrison was 58 years old, a black woman who had risen through the ranks of New York's legal system through brilliance and persistence, who had faced her own battles with prejudice and emerged with both compassion and steel in her judicial philosophy. Grace watched the judge settle into her chair and felt something loosen in her chest, not quite hope, but close to it. Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, both of them projecting confidence that came from assuming they had already won before the hearing began. Lily sat in the first row of the gallery, her hands twisted together in her lap, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. Grace took a breath and made her decision, the one she had been preparing for since Vanessa first burst into the law firm with her accusations. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice carrying across the courtroom with authority that made several people turn to look at her with surprise, "I would like to represent myself and my daughter in this matter." The shock rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, creating expanding circles of reaction that reached every corner of the space. Douglas Barrett stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, his face showing confusion mixed with irritation at having his prepared arguments disrupted before he even began. "Your Honor," he started, but Judge Morrison raised her hand to stop him. Her attention focused entirely on Grace with an intensity that suggested recognition trying to surface through decades of separation. "Are you an attorney, Miss Williams?" the judge asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Grace reached into the leather portfolio she had brought, the one she had not opened in 28 years except to verify its contents remained intact, and withdrew her bar license, current and active despite her years away from practice. "I am, Your Honor," Grace replied, walking forward to hand the documents to the court clerk. "I was admitted to the New York bar in 1992 and maintained my license in good standing throughout the past 3 decades. My name at the time of admission was Grace Montgomery." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone in a room is simultaneously trying to process information that contradicts everything they thought they knew. Vanessa's face went pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against skin drained of color. Barrett grabbed the documents from the law clerk and studied them with the desperation of someone watching their case collapse in real time. Grace had planned this moment for weeks, had rehearsed in her mind exactly how to reveal the truth in layers that would build toward undeniable conclusion. She stood before Judge Morrison with her back straight and her voice steady, no longer the receptionist who had endured microaggressions and harassment, but the attorney she had always been beneath the disguise necessity and strategy had required. "Your Honor, I was a senior partner at Morrison & Associates from 1995 until 1997, Grace began, each word landing with precision. "I specialized in family law and adoption cases, and I was responsible for bringing in several major clients that kept the firm solvent during a period of financial difficulty." The judge's eyes widened slightly, recognition finally clicking into place. "Grace Montgomery," she said softly, almost to herself, then louder, "you argued Morrison versus State of New York, the case that established precedent for sealed adoption records in cases involving abandoned infants." Grace nodded, allowing a small smile. "I did, Your Honor. That case was personal because I had recently begun the adoption process for my daughter Lily, who I found abandoned on my doorstep when she was 6 months old. I filed all proper paperwork, underwent all required home studies and background checks, appeared before a family court judge who approved my petition, and received a final adoption decree in April of 1997. Grace reached into her portfolio again and produced a folder containing documents that had been sealed for 28 years, documents she had the legal right to unseal as both the adoptive parent and an officer of the court. "These are the complete adoption records, filed under my legal name at the time, Grace Montgomery," she said, handing them to the clerk. The revelation detonated in the courtroom like a controlled explosion, destroying Vanessa's case, while simultaneously answering every question that had been raised about Lily's legal status. Douglas Barrett looked at the documents with the expression of a man watching his billable hours evaporate, his carefully constructed arguments reduced to irrelevance by facts he had never thought to investigate. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he tried, grasping for any procedural objection that might slow the collapse. "Miss Williams, or Montgomery, has concealed her identity and practiced deception." Judge Morrison looked at Barrett with the patience of someone who had heard every weak argument in existence. "Counselor," she said, her tone suggesting he should think carefully before continuing, "there is no legal requirement that an attorney disclose their professional credentials when working in a non-legal capacity. Nor is there any requirement that a parent use the same surname throughout their child's life. The adoption records appear complete and properly executed. Do you have any evidence of fraud or procedural irregularity, or are you simply upset that your client failed to conduct adequate due diligence?" Barrett sat down, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Vanessa grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent that he shook his head at, clearly indicating there was nothing he could do to salvage the situation. Grace watched them without satisfaction, feeling only the weariness that came from having to prove what should never have required proof, from having to defend her right to love her daughter against attacks rooted in prejudice and greed. Grace was not finished, had more truth to reveal beyond the adoption records, because Vanessa's campaign had been built on multiple false assumptions that deserved correction. Your Honor, I would also like to address the underlying premise of Miss Sterling's claim, which is that my daughter Lily has no right to inherit from her late husband Marcus Sterling. Grace continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years arguing cases and winning them. Miss Sterling has suggested that Lily's inheritance claim is fraudulent because she was adopted rather than biological, which shows a fundamental misunderstanding of adoption law in New York. Once an adoption is finalized, the adopted child has identical legal rights to inheritance as a biological child. This is established law and has been for decades. Grace paused, letting that sink in, then continued with the information that would shift the entire case. However, there is another issue we need to address, which is that Miss Sterling's claim assumes Marcus Sterling died intestate without a will. This is incorrect. Grace produced another document from her portfolio, this one bearing the seal of a probate attorney and dated 3 months before Marcus' death. Marcus Sterling executed a last will and testament in which he left his entire estate to his wife Lily Sterling, with no provisions for any children born outside the marriage. The probate attorney, who holds the original will, James Chen of Chen & Associates, was prepared to file it in probate court, but was prevented from doing so by irregularities in the estate administration that he has reported to the appropriate authorities. Vanessa stood up suddenly, her chair clattering backward, her composure finally cracking under the weight of exposure. "That's impossible," she shouted, her voice shrill with panic. "Marcus told me he never made a will. He promised me our baby would inherit everything." Judge Morrison banged her gavel once, the sound sharp and final. "Miss Sterling, you will sit down and remain silent unless I direct a question to you specifically," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Vanessa sat, her hands shaking, tears beginning to streak through her makeup in ways that might have evoked sympathy if her actions had not been so calculated and cruel. Grace felt Lila's eyes on her from the gallery, could sense her daughter's confusion and relief and questions building like pressure behind a dam. Grace wanted to turn around and meet Lily's gaze, wanted to say everything she had held back for weeks, but she maintained her focus on Judge Morrison because the work was not yet complete. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence regarding Miss Sterling's conduct throughout this matter that I believe the court needs to consider," Grace said. "She has engaged in a systematic campaign of defamation and harassment designed to destroy my reputation and my relationship with my daughter. This evidence includes recordings of public statements containing racial slurs and false accusations, documentation of social media posts that meet the legal definition of defamation, and witness testimony regarding workplace harassment." Grace had collected everything meticulously, had documented each incident with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how evidence needed to be presented in court. Douglas Barrett made one last attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his case, standing to address the judge with desperation poorly masked as professional concern. "Your Honor, even if we accept Miss Montgomery's credentials and the adoption records, there remains the question of why she concealed her identity for so many years," he said. "This pattern of deception raises questions about her fitness as a guardian and her motivations in this matter." It was a weak argument, grasping at shadows, but it required response. Judge Morrison looked at Grace with an expression that suggested the judge had her own theories, but wanted to hear the explanation firsthand. "Miss Montgomery, would you care to address counsel's concern?" she asked. Grace nodded, grateful for the opportunity to explain what she had been unable to tell Lily directly. I retired from active legal practice in 1997 specifically to focus on raising my daughter without the pressures and expectations that would have come from being known as Grace Montgomery's child, Grace said. I wanted Lily to develop her own identity, to succeed or struggle based on her own merits rather than my connections or reputation. When she decided to marry Marcus Sterling, I chose to return to the firm where I had once been a partner, but in a position where I would be invisible, so I could observe Marcus' character when he thought I was powerless. Grace paused, her voice thick with emotion but still controlled. I wanted to know if he would treat me with respect when he believed I was just a receptionist, if he would honor his commitment to my daughter when he thought there were no consequences for betrayal. Unfortunately, he failed that test, but by then I had collected evidence that would protect Lily's interests, regardless of what happened to the marriage. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she processed everything Grace had revealed. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to see how the judge would respond to a situation that had transformed from a simple inheritance dispute into something far more complex and emotionally charged. Grace, the judge said, using her first name with the familiarity of recognition, I believe I know you, though it's been many years. Did you clerk for Judge William Harrison in 1993? Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at the memory. I did, Your Honor, she replied. And you were his law clerk the year before me. Patricia Morrison smiled, the expression transforming her judicial sternness into something more human and connected. You taught me more about family law in one lunch conversation than I learned an entire semester of law school, she said. I have followed your career, or what I could find of it after you disappeared from public practice. I always wondered what happened to you. Grace gestured toward Lily in the gallery. She happened, Your Honor, Grace said simply. And I have never regretted a single choice I made to put her first. The judge nodded, understanding passing between them that transcended words, a recognition of the sacrifices women, particularly women of color, made to protect what mattered most. Judge Morrison turned her attention to Douglas Barrett and Vanessa, her expression hardening. Based on the evidence presented today, I am prepared to make several rulings, she said. The transformation of power in the courtroom was complete and irreversible. Vanessa and her attorney reduced to defendants in a case they had initiated believing they would win easily. Judge Morrison outlined her rulings with precision that came from years on the bench and a clear understanding of both law and justice. First, the adoption of Lily Sterling, born Lily Montgomery, was legal and properly executed, giving her full rights as Grace Montgomery's daughter and all legal protections afforded to adopted children under New York law, the judge stated. Second, the last will and testament of Marcus Sterling is valid and supersedes any claims under intestate succession, meaning his estate passes entirely to his widow Lily Sterling as he specified. Third, Miss Vanessa Sterling's claims have no legal merit and are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Judge Morrison paused, letting those rulings settle, then continued with the consequences that would follow from Vanessa's actions. Furthermore, based on the evidence of defamation, harassment, and false statements presented by Miss Montgomery, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible criminal charges including perjury, fraud, and defamation. The judge looked directly at Vanessa, who was crying openly now, her carefully constructed facade completely destroyed. Miss Sterling, you came into this court making serious accusations without conducting proper investigation. You engaged in a public campaign designed to destroy a woman's reputation based on racial prejudice and false assumptions, and you attempted to deprive a grieving widow of her legal inheritance. These actions have consequences. Vanessa stood with her lawyer's assistance, her voice broken and small when she finally spoke. Your Honor, I didn't know. I thought. She started but could not finish. Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly but remained firm. Ignorance is not an excuse, and intent does not erase harm, she said. The consequences Grace proposed to Judge Morrison were rooted in principles of restorative justice rather than pure retribution, a framework she had studied extensively during her years practicing family law and one she believed offered the only path toward genuine healing and systemic change. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of everything that had transpired, "I would like to request that the court consider alternatives to immediate criminal prosecution that might serve both justice and education. Vanessa Sterling has caused significant harm through her actions, but I believe that harm was rooted in ignorance and prejudice rather than pure malice, and those roots can be addressed through proper intervention." Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression suggesting both surprise and interest at Grace's unexpected mercy. "What specifically are you proposing, Miss Montgomery?" the judge asked. Grace glanced at Vanessa, who sat with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from genuine remorse or at least genuine fear of consequences. "I propose that Miss Sterling be required to participate in a comprehensive restorative justice program that includes education about racial bias, implicit prejudice, and the legal and ethical dimensions of adoption and family law. She should complete community service working with organizations that support single mothers and adopted families, particularly in communities of color. She should also participate in mediation sessions, where she can hear directly from people affected by the kind of defamation campaign she orchestrated. In exchange for successful completion of this program, I would not oppose a recommendation for probation rather than incarceration." Judge Morrison considered this carefully, then turned to the district attorney's representative who had been called to observe the proceedings. The DA, a woman named Catherine Torres, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, given the defendant's pregnancy and the victim's willingness to pursue restorative rather than purely punitive measures, our office would be open to such an arrangement contingent on Miss Sterling's full cooperation and completion of all requirements." The courtroom emptied slowly after Judge Morrison adjourned the hearing to draft formal orders incorporating Grace's proposed restorative justice framework. Lily had remained in her seat throughout the proceedings, watching her mother transform from the woman she thought she knew into someone far more complex and powerful. And now she waited as Grace gathered her documents and prepared to face the daughter she had protected through deception and sacrifice. Grace turned and met Lily's eyes for the first time since the hearing began, seeing tears streaming down her daughter's face and an expression that mixed relief, confusion, anger, and love in proportions Grace could not immediately measure. They moved toward each other simultaneously, meeting in the aisle between the gallery seats, and Lily grabbed Grace's arms with a grip that was almost painful in its intensity. "Mom," Lily said, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace reached up to cup her daughter's face, her thumbs wiping away tears that kept falling despite the gesture. "I should have told you sooner," Grace said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to protect you from expectations and pressure. Wanted you to build your own life without my shadow hanging over everything you did. When you married Marcus, I needed to know if he would honor you regardless of whether he thought I had power or connections. I was wrong to keep the truth hidden for so long and am so sorry for the pain that caused." Lily pulled Grace into an embrace that felt like coming home after years of wandering, both women holding each other while years of unspoken truths and fears dissolved in the safety of physical connection. "I never doubted you were my mother," Lily whispered against Grace's shoulder. "Not really, not in my heart. I was just scared and confused, and everything felt like it was falling apart." Grace tightened her arms around her daughter. "I know, baby," she replied. "But we're going to rebuild everything on a foundation of complete honesty from now on. No more secrets, no more hiding. We face everything together." The months following the hearing brought transformation that rippled outward from Grace and Lily's reconciliation into wider circles of institutional and community change. Grace accepted the offer from Morrison and Associates to return as senior partner, but with conditions that addressed the cultural problems she had observed during her time as receptionist. She insisted on implementing mandatory training about implicit bias and microaggressions for all staff, establishing mentorship programs specifically for attorneys of color, and creating transparent promotion criteria that would prevent the kind of systemic discrimination she had witnessed and experienced. Richard Thornton, the managing partner who had suggested Grace take leave during the scandal, offered a public apology at the firm's monthly meeting, acknowledging how the firm had failed to recognize her despite her legacy and had allowed workplace harassment to occur unchecked. Sarah Chen and Tom Rodriguez privately apologized to Grace as well, both admitting they had been too quick to believe accusations and too slow to offer support when she needed it most. Robert Chen, the junior partner who had stood by Grace throughout the ordeal, was promoted to senior partner alongside Grace, his loyalty and integrity recognized as the kind of character the firm needed to model. Grace used her restored position to take on pro bono cases involving adoption rights, racial discrimination, and family law matters affecting marginalized communities, transforming her personal experience into professional advocacy that helped dozens of families navigate systems designed to exclude them. Vanessa Sterling completed her restorative justice program with a thoroughness that surprised even Grace, attending every educational session, completing every assignment, and participating in mediation circles where she heard directly from Black women who had experienced the kind of defamation and discrimination she had perpetrated. The program included sessions led by social workers, diversity consultants, and legal experts who helped Vanessa understand how racial bias had shaped her assumptions about Grace, how privilege had blinded her to the harm her actions caused, and how implicit prejudice operated even in people who did not consider themselves racist. Vanessa wrote a formal apology letter to Grace and Lily that was published in the same media outlets that had covered her initial accusations, taking full responsibility for her actions and acknowledging the racial dynamics that had motivated her campaign. I allowed my grief and fear to manifest as cruelty toward a woman who had done nothing wrong, Vanessa wrote. I used racial stereotypes and prejudice to attack Grace Montgomery because I thought her apparent lack of power made her an easy target. I was wrong in every possible way, and I have spent these months learning to recognize and dismantle the biases that led me to cause such profound harm. Grace read the letter with Lily beside her, both women recognizing the genuine transformation in Vanessa's words while also maintaining healthy boundaries about what forgiveness required. When Vanessa's baby was born 3 months later, she reached out to Lily with a request that Grace helped her daughter navigate carefully. Vanessa asked if Lily might be willing to maintain some connection with the child, who was Marca's biological sibling to Lily through their father. After much discussion, and with clear boundaries established, Lily agreed to occasional supervised visits, choosing to extend grace to an innocent child while protecting herself from further manipulation. The Grace Montgomery Foundation was established 6 months after the hearing, funded initially by a portion of Marca's estate that Lily decided to dedicate to causes her mother had spent a lifetime championing. The foundation's mission focused on 3 interconnected areas that reflected Grace's journey and values. First, it provided financial support and legal assistance to single mothers, particularly women of color, who were navigating adoption processes or fighting to maintain custody of their children against systems designed to separate families. Second, it offered scholarships to students from marginalized backgrounds pursuing legal education, with a specific focus on family law and civil rights. Third, it funded racial equity training and implicit bias education for institutions including law firms, courts, schools, and social service agencies. Grace and Lily served as co-directors, building an organization that transformed personal pain into systemic change. They hired staff members who brought lived experience with the issues the foundation addressed, created grant programs that empowered community organizations, rather than imposing external solutions, and established partnerships with law schools to create clinical programs where students could gain experience while providing free legal services to families in need. The Foundation's first annual documented helping 43 families successfully complete adoptions, providing legal representation in 12 custody cases that resulted in family preservation, and training over 200 professionals in racial equity practices. Grace looked at those numbers and thought about the 28 years she had spent hidden, protecting one daughter, and felt grateful that her revelation now allowed her to protect hundreds more. The relationship between Grace and Lily deepened in ways that transcended their pre-crisis bond, rebuilt on foundations of complete honesty and mutual respect that replaced the protective deceptions Grace had maintained. They had difficult conversations about Grace's choices, Lily expressing hurt about the years of secrecy while also understanding the motivations behind it, Grace accepting responsibility for the ways her decisions had caused pain even as they were meant to prevent it. They talked about Marcus' betrayal, Lily processing her grief and anger with her mother's support, both women acknowledging the complexity of loving someone who had proven unworthy of that love while not diminishing the genuine moments they had shared. Grace told Lily stories about her years as a practicing attorney, cases she had won and lost, the reasons she had walked away from success to focus on motherhood, the satisfaction she had found in those supposedly invisible years as a receptionist watching her daughter thrive. Lily shared her own experiences of navigating professional spaces as a white woman married to wealth, admitting she had sometimes taken for granted privileges her mother never had, recognizing now how Grace had deliberately created distance to let Lily learn those lessons without interference. They worked together at the Foundation, Grace teaching Lily about legal strategy and advocacy while Lily brought her architectural perspective to designing programs and spaces that served their mission. Mother and daughter became true partners, their relationship no longer defined by protection and dependence but by collaboration and shared purpose. On the first anniversary of the courthouse hearing, they planted a tree in the courtyard of the Foundation's office, a Japanese maple that would transform its appearance with seasons while maintaining strong roots, a living metaphor for family built through choice and sustained through change. Grace stood at a podium 18 months after the hearing, addressing a conference of family law attorneys about adoption rights and racial justice, her story now part of a larger narrative about systemic change and personal transformation. The audience included Judge Patricia Morrison, who had become a close friend and mentor again, Robert Chen, who continued to work alongside Grace at Morrison and Associates, while also serving on the Foundation's board, and Lily, who sat in the front row with the kind of pride that radiated visibly across her features. Grace spoke about the ways legal systems could either support or destroy families, about how implicit bias shaped everything from custody decisions to workplace treatment, about the importance of laws that protected rather than policed non-traditional family structures. She talked about her own experience hiding her identity and the reasons she had felt that choice was necessary, acknowledging both the protection it had provided and the costs it had extracted. Then Grace shifted her focus to hope, to the changes she had witnessed in the past year and a half, to the families the Foundation had helped stay together, to the attorneys they had trained, who were bringing new perspectives into courtrooms across the state. Justice is not about revenge, Grace said, her voice carrying to every corner of the conference room. It's about restoration, education, and ensuring that harm is acknowledged, addressed, and prevented from recurring. The audience applauded, and Grace saw Vanessa Sterling sitting near the back of the room, her baby asleep in a carrier against her chest, her presence unexpected but somehow appropriate. After the speech, Vanessa approached cautiously, asking if Grace had a moment to talk. They found a quiet corner, and Vanessa thanked Grace for the opportunity to change rather than simply being punished. I am teaching my daughter about the mistakes I made and the lessons I learned so she grows up understanding that justice and mercy can coexist, Vanessa said. Grace nodded, seeing in Vanessa's transformation the kind of outcome restorative justice was meant to achieve, not erasure of harm, but genuine accountability and growth. The Foundation's second anniversary celebration filled a community center in Harlem with families they had served, attorneys they had trained, partners they had collaborated with, and supporters who believed in their mission. Grace and Lily stood together greeting guests, their connection visible in synchronized movements and shared glances that communicated without words. Sarah Chen and Tom Rodriguez attended, having become genuine allies rather than merely apologetic colleagues, both now volunteering their legal expertise for the Foundation's cases. Richard Thornton made a substantial donation and announced that Morrison and Associates would match all contributions to the Foundation for the next 5 years, his way of acknowledging institutional responsibility for past failures. Judge Patricia Morrison gave a speech about Grace's legacy in family law and her continued impact on justice, calling her one of the most important legal minds of their generation regardless of how many years she had spent away from courtroom practice. Robert Chen presented the Foundation's impact report, documenting how they had helped over 100 families, trained 500 professionals, and influenced policy changes in 3 states regarding adoption procedures and racial equity in family court. Lily spoke last, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. My mother taught me that love transcends biology, that family is built through commitment and sacrifice, that justice requires both accountability and mercy, she said. Sacrifice, that justice requires both accountability and mercy, she said. She also taught me that power comes not from position or recognition, but from integrity and purpose. I am grateful every day that Grace Montgomery chose to be my mother, and I am proud to work alongside her building a future where no family has to fight as hard as we did to prove their worth. Grace closed the evening with words that captured everything she had learned and everything she hoped to pass forward to the families and communities the Foundation served. She stood at the microphone with Lily beside her, their hands linked, and looked out at faces representing every shade and background and story that made up their city's beautiful complexity. 28 years ago, I found my daughter on a doorstep in freezing rain, and she became the center of my universe, Grace began. I built my life around protecting her, around making sure she had every opportunity I could provide, around loving her with everything I had. When that love was questioned, when my right to be her mother was challenged based on racial prejudice and false assumptions, I could have responded with anger and immediate revelation. Instead, I waited, I documented, I built a case not just for my own vindication but for systemic change. Grace paused, squeezing Lily's hand. What I learned through that experience is that justice delayed for strategic purposes can be justice amplified, that individual vindication can become collective transformation, that our personal pain can fuel broader healing if we choose to channel it that way. Every family we have helped through this foundation represents a choice to turn my story into their protection, to make sure no one else has to prove their worth the way I did. Grace looked directly at the young mothers in the audience, women who reminded her of herself decades ago. You are enough exactly as you are, she said. Your love is valid, your family is real, and your rights deserve protection. Do not let anyone make you invisible. Do not let anyone question your worthiness, and know that there are people fighting to make sure the systems that tried to break you are transformed into systems that support you instead. The applause that followed was not polite acknowledgement but genuine celebration, recognition of truth spoken with authority earned through lived experience. Have you or someone you know ever been underestimated because of how they looked? Grace asked the audience as the formal program concluded, and people began moving toward the reception area. Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we read every single one. The invitation was met with immediate response, people pulling out phones to engage with the Foundation's social media presence, others approaching Grace and Lily directly to share experiences of discrimination overcome or still being fought. The energy in the room reflected possibility rather than resignation, collective power rather than isolated struggle. If this story moved you, Grace continued, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of justice and resilience. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. She gestured toward the screens positioned around the room where the Foundation's documentary series about families they had served played on loop, each story a testament to the power of legal advocacy combined with community support. Want to see another powerful story right now? Grace said with a smile that held both warmth and determination. Click on the video appearing on your screen. You won't regret it. And thank you for being part of our community, for believing that change is possible, and for standing with families who deserve nothing less than full recognition of their dignity and worth. The evening continued with conversations that would lead to new partnerships, new cases, new opportunities to expand the Foundation's reach and impact. Grace moved through the crowd with Lily beside her, no longer hiding her power or her past, no longer protecting through invisibility but leading through example, transforming personal vindication into collective liberation, one family at a time. Drop a comment 28 if you believe a mother's love transcends biology. 28 years, she raised her daughter with dignity and sacrifice, and today we honor that unbreakable bond.